When Jesus preached this sermon, the people who came to hear him didn't bring a pencil. They didn't bring a notebook. There was no PowerPoint. They didn't have a Bible. And if they had, they would have been unable to read it because they were mostly illiterate. They were not Pharisees. They were not Sadducees. They were not the teachers of the law. They were not scribes. They were the people of the land. They were desperately poor, paying enormous taxes to Rome, and had no hope that life would ever be any different. And they had waited for 500 years for God to keep his promise and to send a mighty warrior, the Son of Man, who would establish the kingdom of God. And there was this guy named Jesus, and rumors were afoot. Could this be the guy? And so they go to hear him preach, and he says something like this. I know you think you're a bunch of losers. I know you think life has passed you by. I know you think God has forgotten you, but I want you to know that God blesses you. And that what you have been waiting for 500 years has now arrived. Everything you've ever dreamed of, everything you've ever wanted, everything you've ever been able to imagine God doing is now being fulfilled now. Every word of Torah is coming to pass before your eyes. And I know you've heard you shouldn't murder. But I'm telling you, we got to get way before murder. We've got to talk about the angry thoughts that lead to insults, that lead to demeaning, that lead to violence, because we have an anger problem here. And I know that you've heard that it's been said that you shouldn't commit adultery, but I got to tell you, our problem with sex arrives long before we ever get to the bed. And I know you've heard it said that if you're going to get a divorce, you have to do the paperwork right. But I'm telling you, covenant breaking is serious business. And I know you've been told that if you swear by something important, you ought to keep your word. But I'm telling you, I want you to have an integrity that runs so deep that no oath you could take would add anything to your words. And I know you've been told that if you're going to retaliate, you got to keep it in proportions. But I'm telling you, you got to carry the second bag of groceries. And you have to find humorous and comedic ways to answer anger. Not anger with anger. And I know you've heard that it was said you should love people who love you back, but I'm telling you, you got to learn to love your enemies. And you don't do this religion thing to be seen by people. Because when you do it to be seen by people and they see you, well, you got what you were looking for. But I'm telling you that your religious practices have to do with your relationship with God, not impressing other people. And I know you don't have much, but I want you to know that God sees your needs and responds to them. And when you get too obsessed with the material things of this world, your eyes go bad. And you can't serve God and money. So seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added to you. And boy, you got to watch those judgmental attitudes, because it is really easy to see what's wrong with everybody else. And maybe you ought to turn that sharp eye on yourself from time to time. And instead of being judgmental, maybe the generosity of God could become your generosity. And as the good Father gives to you, then you could give to other people. And in fact, you would treat other people the way that you would like to be treated. And I got to warn you, on this religion thing, there are a lot of people that talk a good game. And there are a lot of people who talk about God who don't have your best interest at heart. And worse yet, there are some who talk about God and don't know how lost they are. And after this magnificent sermon, he closes with a VBS song. The one who hears these sayings of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rains came and the streams rose and the winds beat against the house, but it stood firm because it had its foundation on the rock. But the one who hears these sayings of mine and does not put them into practice is like the foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rains came and the streams rose and the winds beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash because it didn't have a solid foundation. I have enormous respect for the speakers here this week. I'm particularly grateful for Carl McKelvey's presence on the program, who kept me from being the contrast with Dave Clayton. But none of these speakers can explain to you what the Sermon on the Mount means. Because you already know. I've read it, and it just isn't that complicated. Okay, I'll give you 7:6, that one about pearls and swine and dogs. I'll give you that one. That one's a little hard to interpret. But for the most part, the sermon is extraordinarily straightforward. And what Jesus is trying to declare to these people, that the kingdom has come and now this is the way we live in it. And he concludes the sermon by saying, wisdom is found in doing this. Nothing that will happen in the next couple of days will transform your life. Something could happen that would lead to transformation. But there is one and only one way to understand the Sermon on the Mount, and that is to go out and see what happens when you do some of it. This is not material to be mastered. It is a call to action. It is a call to live in a radically different way, in a way that is going to make little sense to the world, but makes perfect sense in the kingdom of God. And if you want to find out what it's about, you try to do some of it. I have worked for academic institutions my whole adult life. And I like to teach. Teaching's a cool thing when it happens. I'm coming back from class and somebody says, "Did you teach them anything today?" I say, "Well, I taught at them." I don't know if any of it took. And there are some things you sort of have to learn as you get started. I learned to play chess while I was teaching here at Lipscomb. former Lipscomb student. I doubt he's here. If you're here, Chris, give me a shout out. He was an art student, and he really liked to play chess. And he says, "You know how to play chess?" And I said, "No." And he says, "How about if I teach you?" And I said, "Great." And so he did, and he won all the time. And this was frustrating because he was a C+ student. I got tired of losing, so I went out and got a book called How to Win in Chess, because that's what I wanted to do. And the first chapter in the book was about how the different men move. And it is much easier to play chess once you know how the men move. And I will grant you, you can learn that by reading a book. But I assure you, there is only one way to learn to play chess, and that is to play somebody who's better than you and lose a lot. That's the way you learn to play chess. And the way you learn the Sermon on the Mount is, first of all, memorizing it. That's learning how the people move. Okay, so that's your first challenge. That will, you probably won't get that done the next 2 days, but that does have the possibility of future transformation of your life. And the great thing is, while you're memorizing the Sermon on the Mount, it's hard to be doing anything really bad at the same time. But then after you learn how the men move, after you memorize the sermon, you pick a little piece of it and say, you know, I think I'll go try this today. And all I can do is share with you from my own experience. Oh, are you going to fail a lot? And you draw a little bit closer to the kingdom. One of my favorite authors is Samuel Beckett. He's one of those authors I like. He never wrote a clear word in his life. And he wrote one book that is almost totally gibberish. And in the middle of this book, you have this wonderful line that has just kind of stuck with me forever. Ever tried, ever failed. Never mind. Try again. Fail better. And living the Sermon on the Mount is basically about trying and trying again and failing better. My own conviction is that the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' very practical advice about kingdom living, and that it is actually possible to learn to do this. That is, Jesus expects us to experiment, and in our experimenting, learn how to do this better. Okay, let me talk about one of the areas in which I have really deep expertise, marriage. That's one of the great things about being a college professor. You get to perform quite a few weddings. And for a non-Catholic minister, a wedding is the single greatest moment of power in our lives. Because we don't get to do the transubstantiation thing with communion. But when you say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, they weren't, and then they are. You change reality by simply saying the words. And I don't know about the rest of you preachers, but whenever I do it, I pause before I say them. Because I want to feel the power. And I have performed 2 ceremonies for people who were already married, one on purpose, one on accident. Well, that almost requires some explanation, doesn't it? I was getting ready to marry this couple that I didn't know so well, and I asked for the marriage license, and the guy says, well, I need to tell you about that. I said, really? He says, yes. I said, what? He said, we couldn't wait. We eloped. We've been married for a week. I said, how many people here know this? He says, nobody but you. He said, is that okay? And I said, well, I guess. You can't mess this up. But I got to my big moment. I now pronounce you husband and wife, and I wasn't feeling it. I was going to change nothing. So just for spite, I said, I pronounce you husband and wife, flipped off my microphone and said, still. And they laughed so hard they couldn't kiss. So people were coming up afterwards and saying, what did you say to them? And I said, I don't know, ask them. When I pronounced them husband and wife, I don't know about her, but I can tell you about him. He's going to spend the rest of his life trying to become what I pronounced him to be, because he is clueless. And when marriages go well, people learn to love each other better. And from what they've told me, it's largely an experiment, and there's some failure involved. But you try, and then you try to fail better. The only thing we can hope for this week is that something will happen that will inspire you or make it click and say, I am going to engage in an experiment. I'm going to find out for myself if anything Jesus says about kingdom living in the Sermon on the Mount is true or not. And what's better if you decided that and said, and in fact, not only am I going to do this, I'm going to get 3 or 4 people to try this with me. And we're going to engage in an experiment in living the Sermon on the Mount. When those people came out to that hill to hear Jesus, they didn't go out there for a seminar. They went out there looking for life. And if you fill up your notebook, well, okay, we had a good seminar. But if you try something, try anything, then we can say, the kingdom of God has come. Blessed be the name of the Lord.